consumption. We are gathering together in God's name. Let's have a word of prayer. Our gracious Lord God, we thank you for this few minutes together. We thank you for your holy word of goodness and truth, your great love letter to us. We thank you for the gift of community. And we pray, Lord, that we will embrace it even as you embrace community in your very existence. We praise you, God, for those who have been faithful members of this congregation for these many, many years. We thank you for their living out the gift of stability, being stable in one place, and how that is a reflection of the stability of your love for us in our own lives. Now I pray you, Lord, that you will watch over us for these few minutes, and that my words and the meditations of all our hearts will be meaningful and pleasing in your sight. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Well, welcome everyone. This is a sort of a mash of a number of different presentations that I like to do on churches and sort of the church in America today and why we are in the place we are. Not that we're in a bad place, but how did you get here? What caused us to get here? What are things we need to consider as we are moving forward? We are recording this, but it will be edited. Thanks be to God. And this is going to be more of a presentation style. I'm happy to take questions. I would prefer to do it at the very end, but you do have the handouts. The primary handout is the one that you've probably got on top that says welcome. That would be the one that I'm working with. The other handouts are expansions of some points that I'm going to make. So I invite you to take copious notes or not, however you may wish. And I will be happy to talk about this all afternoon when we're done. Let me begin by saying something that I think I've said several times, but can never be said enough. We are a good church. This is a good church. We are a good congregation. I firmly believe that our best days are still ahead of us. Remember that we worship a God of resurrection, and when the time is right, I know God will bring us the right pastor to lead us into the church God wants us to be in this. So with that in mind, I want to begin by talking about change. I want to begin by talking a little bit about change, and I just know, I said I was going to take questions at the end, but this is the one point where I really want active participation. How has the world changed in the last 50 years? Tell me, how has the world changed? Give me some examples of how the world has changed in the last 50 years.
Technology, computers.
Technology, computers. What else?
Cell phones.
Cell phones. Other things. Cars. Electric cars. Oh my gosh. Who'd have thought? Women preachers. In Presbyterianism, you didn't see that many of them 50 years ago. Remember one of my elders who has long since gone to her rest. The first time a woman came to serve her communion, she thought, I hope that woman doesn't think she's going to serve me communion. Okay, that has changed. How have churches changed in the last 50 years? Give me some examples of how churches have changed in the last 50 years.
Using media and going online.
Using media, going online. We were doing it before the pandemic, but not nearly as much, right? Using media, going online. What else? How have churches changed?
Less attendance.
Lower attendance. Okay. What's another change?
Sunday schools.
Sunday schools, which were not part of the early church. Sunday schools were an invention of the Industrial Reformation in England, when it was realized that children working in the cotton mills were not going to school. And so churches began teaching children to read on Sunday mornings, and then expanding from there into Bible study. For centuries, it had been, if you want to study the Bible, do it quietly at home. The church is where we go to worship God. Sunday schools, seen their ebb and flow. How many of you ladies remember wearing hats to worship? Thank you for being that brave. Yes, it's been a long time, hasn't it? Yeah. When I don't make a point of counting on Sundays, but I would imagine that most Sundays, the women who shake my hand going through the line are not wearing dresses. They're wearing pants of some kind. So change happens, right? Change is a part of life. It just happens. One of the examples of change, one of the examples of church trends we heard was attendance. Gallup does their annual poll, 2021, 47% of Americans belong to a church, a synagogue, or a mosque. Okay, 47%. When they first started doing that survey in 1937, 73% of Americans belong to a house of worship. That's a decline, isn't it? My church in Iowa that I just came from, when I got there, they were already sort of doing some of the statistical gathering and finding information. 5-year trends, 2013 to 2017, Presbyterian Church USA, attendance down by 25%. Contribution decline down by 15% in just those 5 years. The Synod, and this is the Synod of Living Waters, no, Lakes and Prairies, right? Yeah, Synod of Lakes and Prairies, the same. Attendance down by 25%, contributions down by almost 37%. So how is this? Why is all of this happening? Well, there are several things that are playing into it. Let me begin by talking about bowling. Okay. In the mid-1990s, there was a fellow named Putnam, I believe Roger Putnam, professor at Harvard University, and he was studying social cohesion. He was thinking that, society isn't holding together as well as it used to. And of course, he has to find statistics on that. So one of the things he looks at is bowling practices from the mid-1950s to the mid-1990s when he was writing. And one of the things he found was that people are bowling just as much today as they were in the 1990s as they were in the mid-50s. The difference is that in the 50s, everybody was bowling alone. In the 1950s, people were bowling in leagues. In the 1990s, they were bowling alone. Just as many people bowling, but they were no longer bowling in leagues. They were bowling alone. Well, Putnam took this and he ran with it. He wrote a very important essay called Bowling Alone. If you Google it this afternoon, you can read it in 2 hours. It's an easy read. I highly recommend it. He went on then to write a book called Bowling Alone, where he sort of extrapolates and goes more into his statistical methods, and he brings up other examples. But the bowling is the one that is still catching everybody. And Putnam's finding is that the mid-1950s were the high point for voluntary organizations in America. The mid-1950s were the high water mark for voluntary organizations in America. Ever since then, they have been on the decline. And churches are a voluntary organization. When was the last time you saw the International Order of Oddfellows? Woodmen of the world. Are the Masons still a going concern? I mean, they're around, but they're not growing. Even the American Legion, which you would think would be bursting at the seams now, even the American Legion is having a very hard time attracting new members. So it's not just churches, it's everybody is experiencing this effects of the decline of social cohesion. There are other differences mean, there are plenty of reasons for this, other reasons. One of them has to do with simple generational differences. You know, by and large, if you are under 40 today, if you are under 40, you have an almost visceral knee-jerk mistrust of centralized authority. You just mistrust centralized authority. If you are under 40, you are very adept at paying your bills online and paying for your lunch with your phone. Went out to eat with one of my young cousins, and he was annoyed that he couldn't pay for his lunch with his phone. He had to reach in his wallet and pull out his credit card to pay for his lunch. Be a good time when we're able to do our Sunday offering. Anybody can do it on their phone. There is a way to do it. We just haven't done it. If you are under 40, there is very little, if any, social benefit to you for worshiping on Sunday morning. There's no social benefit to you for worshiping on Sunday morning if you are under 40. If you are under 40, the social benefit is having brunch with your friends. That is where the great social benefit is. If you are under 40, generally speaking, you are pretty stressed and busy most of the time. This is where somebody says, oh, but my generation was stressed. Yes, your generation was stressed, and you got up and you milked 10 cows and you got 8 children ready for Sunday school and your husband. I understand that. I'm saying in their minds, they are stressed and busy most of the time. And so if you're that way, you're not inclined to commit yourself to a leadership position for 3 years. Maybe a year, maybe a 2, but don't ask me for 3 years. I can't see that far into the future. So one of my friends in Cincinnati, young man, early 30s, professional musician. He and his wife were both professional musicians. They belonged to a small, not-for-profit orchestra in the area. This is Cincinnati, so lots of really good musicians. And he said, Ken, we've got plenty of people who want to come and rehearse, plenty of people who want to come and play. That's not an issue. Our problem is finding people who will get there early and set up the chairs. Our problem is finding people who will stay late and clean up. Our problem is finding somebody who will be the president, the secretary, treasurer, somebody who will call around and book us at different locations. Plenty of people wanting to be a part, but not that many people wanting to be in leadership and commit themselves to it. Now, there's more that I could say about that, but that's enough for now. And everything I just said was true back in 2019. But what the pandemic has done, is to further weaken the social bonds that are holding us together. And it's not just people under 40, it's people of all ages. I want to share with you some more reasons that churches are having difficulty. This comes from a fellow named Newhop. If you're not familiar with Newhop, I recommend looking him up. The fuller version is one of your handouts. This is just the abbreviated version right here. We've got more money. We have more options for things to do on Sunday morning. We have a higher focus on youth activities. We have leagues, we have traveling leagues. And in today's culture, you're a good parent if you are at every game, especially the traveling games. Wasn't that way when I was that age, okay? But society changes. In today's culture, you're a good parent if on Sunday morning you travel with your child to that away game. And it's not just parents who are traveling. Snowbirds are healthier, they're living longer, they want to go on trips too. They want to travel around. Blended and single parent families. Which church are we going to this week? I'm not sure. I only get you every other weekend. I'm not going to spend a quarter of the time I have with you sitting quietly somewhere. I want to be with you during this entire weekend. So they may be going to a lot of churches, they may be going to none at all. Online options, all of you know how to go online and find a worship service. You know how to find a preacher better than anybody was, better than me, certainly. There are lots of them online. They're easy to find. And as a society, we've gotten rid of guilt, which is too bad. Guilt makes you grow. That's probably just as well. Hey, and self-directed spirituality, especially if you don't trust centralized authority. And my Lord, if all you know about Christianity is what you hear about religion on the news, I wouldn't want anything to do with it. Right? So I go online. I attend some sort of alternative class at the local, massage, Tai Chi, spirituality center. I can go to the bookstore and find books on it. One of my young cousins got married, and I think it was a Sikh doing the wedding. Said their religion has elements of Christianity and Buddhism and something else. They sort of make up their own spirituality. And failure to see a direct benefit. I went twice. It didn't change my life. Friday night, I went to the Walleye weekend and saw the Tom Petty band, the Tom Petty tribute band. I cannot remember the last time I stood still for 2 hours and sang along with a bunch of perfect strangers. Okay? It left me with nothing. I mean, it didn't change my life. It was really fun. It didn't change my life. It didn't give me a focus. It didn't assure me that I am part of something bigger than myself, all these things that worship does. Okay. Another way to look at this is, friends of mine were in marriage counseling. They'd been married 25 years. They went to marriage counseling twice. They said, well, this is bogus. The marriage counseling didn't work. We went twice. Buddy, it took you 25 years to get in this shape. You think you're going to change this in 2 weeks? Come on, give me a break. But we want to see some immediate impact from our worship service. And Christianity just isn't that way. It's incremental over time. And this, I think, is on the church. We valued attendance over engagement. We were more concerned about how many people were showing up, butts in the pews, than we were with, are people moving out from the pews? Are they engaging with their community? That's where we started putting our emphasis. Okay. So what do we do? What do we do now? Well, let's talk about change. Changing, change. Yeah, you know it, sister. Sing with me. 2 of my sisters here know it. Sing with me, sister. Here's the thing about change. All right. Here's the thing about change. And I'm borrowing here from Heifetz, who's another Harvard professor. I guess you can go somewhere besides Harvard. I don't know, but he's another Harvard professor. And Heifetz postulates that there are 2 types of change. And the first type is what we call technical change. Technical change generally involves finite issues that have specific answers, specific issues, specific problems that are addressed by finite specific answers. So, you've been going out and hitting the track a lot, putting more miles on those running shoes. The running shoes start to wear down. What do? You go to the store, you buy more shoes, right? You have a technical problem. My running shoes are wearing out. There's a technical answer. I go to the store, I buy more shoes. My lava lamp burned out. I took it apart. I unscrewed the little light. I took it to the store. I said, I need one of these. They sold me one. I took it back, screwed it in. My lava lamp works. Okay. Technical problem, technical solution. Bing, bada, boom. Easy. So that's technical change, and that's pretty straightforward. The second type of change that Heifetz talks about is adaptive change. Adaptive change is different. This is big issues. They're big, they're complex, and they generally involve an organization's culture or mindset. Global warming, okay? It's a huge problem. It involves how people think about the environment, but it's also their cultural attitudes towards the environment. Is the environment something that we should live in harmony with? Is the environment something we should control, okay? It does not have an easy technical answer. And I'm sure you can think of other examples: smoking cessation, handgun violence. These are all big, complex issues that are as much about our culture, our social mindset, as they are about anything else. They have no silver bullet solutions. If there were a silver bullet to global warming, we would have found it by now. There's just not. So at this point, then, you have to begin breaking those big problems down into bite-sized pieces that you can tackle with technical change. So let's talk about global warming. We can run advertisements and news programs about the dangers of global warming. We can impose a carbon tax and fuel standards. We can celebrate people who reduce their carbon footprint. We can talk about the importance of reduce, reuse, recycle, and set up recycling bins all over our community to reduce the amount of raw materials that have to be produced at such great expense and energy. The goal is finding small, doable things that address both the issue itself and our attitude towards it. So you get the idea. With large, hairy problems that are as much about culture or mindset as anything else, you have to develop smaller, targeted technical answers that can, over time, shift both the issue and our attitude towards it. This is what one economist I've heard refer to as the problem of the silver pellets. There are no silver bullets, but there are lots of silver pellets. And we use a lot of silver pellets. Over time, they themselves can create radical change. Another way to think about it is that old joke about eating the elephant. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You know, you want to cook an elephant, what do? You cut them into bite-sized pieces. That's how you begin cooking the elephant. So generally then, affecting adaptive change takes a long time. Even seeing the need for it can take a very, very long time. Pollution and global warming. How long had the prophets been saying we've got to do something before everybody sat up and noticed? But sometimes the need for adaptive change rears its head and meets us head on. Sometimes the need for adaptive change just reaches out and smacks us a good one. So let me give you an example of that. And I went the wrong way, and there we go. Let's talk about canoes, paddles, and walking sticks. Back in 1803, who was president of the United States? Thomas Jefferson, thank you. Civics teacher, thank you, sir. Back in 1803, Thomas Jefferson was the president of the United States. And like a lot of people, Jefferson wanted to find an overland route to the Pacific Ocean. Remember, at that time, if you wanted to get from the East Coast to the West Coast quickly, you pretty much had to go by ship, and that could take a very long time indeed. So Thomas Jefferson, like many people, was convinced that there was a river that flowed from the headwaters of the Missouri River west to the Pacific Ocean. And all you had to do, if someone could just find the headwaters of the Missouri River, they would find that big river that flowed all the way out to California. We could go to California quickly, commerce would flourish, everybody would get rich. Remember, this is 1803. Thomas Jefferson is only our third president, and America was far from being fully explored. So President Jefferson hired two men to go and look for that river. First, that was William Clark and Meriwether Lewis. And they hired a crew to make their way up north, up the Missouri River to where it began. And they were convinced, and Lewis and Clark were convinced, that if they found their way up to the headwaters of the Missouri, turn left, easy as pie, there is this huge river. And Lewis and Clark were ideally suited for this mission. First of all, they were frontiersmen, like everybody was, right? They knew how to build a shelter, they knew how to ride a horse, they knew how to shoot an animal and skin it and cut it up into bite-sized pieces, build a fire, cook it. But Lewis and Clark were also river rats. Okay, they knew how to build boats and canoes. They knew how to make paddles. They knew how to navigate on water and draw a map while they were moving. Lewis and Clark were ideal for this mission. Find the Pacific Ocean. That was the mission. Find the Pacific Ocean. Overland, up north, boom, off you go. And so they did. And it took months and months and months, but eventually they got there. They got to the place where you could jump from one side to the other of the Missouri River. And they said, yes, we have found the headwaters. And they splashed around and they celebrated. And then they all turned to their left. They looked west. And what did they see?
Rockies.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. They didn't see a river, did they? They saw the plains and they saw the Rocky Mountains. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? All of a sudden, everything had changed. Everything had changed except the mission. The mission was still the same. Find the route to the Pacific Ocean. But all of a sudden, these river rats had to become mountain men. And that must have been extremely disorienting for them. They had planned for one kind of an expedition on a river, an expedition they knew how to do. All of a sudden, they had a different kind of expedition, a totally different kind of expedition. They had to abandon their boats. They had to hoist their packs onto their backs. They had to turn their paddles into walking sticks. Lewis and Clark had to change their mindset. They had to change their self-perception, their self-identity. They had to adapt to a huge sudden change. They had to embrace adaptive change, okay? They had to embrace adaptive change. And so they did. And I'm sure it was hard, but they adapted. And they made those small individual technical changes they needed to make to become mountaineers. So instead of using the muscles in their arms to paddle the canoes, they used the muscles in their legs to walk with packs on their backs. Instead of using fishing lines and hooks to get their meat, they used rifles and bullets. And they turned their paddles into walking sticks. They turned their paddles into walking sticks. And the mindset must have changed later over time, but it started when they saw the need to adapt and made a number of small technical changes. But one of the smartest things they did, which was a brilliant piece of both adaptive and technical change, was they realized they could no longer rely on their own technical expertise. They were out of their element. They were still frontiersmen, but they didn't know how to find horses out there on the plains, and they certainly knew nothing about crossing the Rocky Mountains. Fortunately, they were smart enough to use their local resources. And they found Sacagawea, right? Sacagawea was the Indian wife of a white fur trader. They had hired the fur trader to guide them and translate, interpret for them. The problem was the fur trader was not a whole lot of use, but Sacagawea was a godsend. And she helped them negotiate buying horses. She showed them the terrain. She kept them alive. So it's an inspiring story, isn't it? And it's also a wonderful example of technical and adaptive change. Faced with huge changes in terrain, but no change to the mission, Lewis and Clark adapted by making technical changes that eventually brought them to the Pacific Ocean. It's an inspiring story. It's an example of adaptive and technical change. And I think it is a metaphor for our time. Make no mistake, the terrain we are operating in has changed. The old ways of worship and ministry and faith formation still matter, okay? But we also have to learn new ways of worship and ministry and faith formation. Our terrain has changed, but our mission is still the same. We are Christians, learning, serving, loving. Our mission is to grow in faith and bring others to Christ, and that hasn't changed. So what can we do? Remembering, of course, that there are no silver bullets. Well, if we just got There are no silver bullets. There are only silver pellets. Well, one of the ways I think we can begin is by re-examining some of our basic assumptions, beginning with what is a church. Now, most people, if you wake them up in the middle of the night and said to them, what is an ideal example of a church? They would say it's a family. I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute, but I really want us to push that the church is not a family. The church is a community of committed believers. The church is a community of committed believers. And in fact, I think it's a difficult idea to get across, but I really think that the best example of a church today would be a monastery without walls, where people are committed to life in community and where it's easy to come in and be a member of that community. Think for a minute. What does our book of orders say is a faithful church? A faithful church proclaims and hears the word of God. It administers and receives the sacrament. It nurtures a covenant community of disciples for Christ. Especially notice that third one. Anything in there about growth? That a successful church is a church that's always growing? Anything in there about vibrant youth activities? Anything in there about having a large number of small groups or an excellent choir? Anything in there about having dazzling technical? Knew a fellow who went to a church in Nashville. They had an indoor fireworks display on the 4th of July. I mean, an indoor fireworks display. The church was that big. That doesn't mean it is a successful church. It does not mean it is a faithful church. So one of the things I think we can do as a way of adaptive and technical change is to begin by rethinking what we think church is and what is the function of church and what should be the focus of church. And there are some other ideas also, some other things that I think we can do. One is to get a handle on our demographics. A lot of people, especially our ages, older, come from very large families. Those large families aren't there anymore, right? They're just, children are marrying later. They're holding off having children when they do. And so the families are going to be smaller. And we may go to Fond du Lac High School and talk to the school superintendent maybe and say, what's the forecast for the next decade for children in Fond du Lac? And they may say, well, you know, it's growing, it's rising. And my question is going to be, how many of them, their native language will be English? How many of them will be coming from somewhere else to come and work in whatever, you know, facilities there are around here? This was especially an issue in Iowa, because, you know, there were something like over 20 something languages taught in the public, spoken in the public school there where I was in Waterloo, because of all the huge number of immigrants coming in. Not a bad thing, but just understanding demographics, embracing technology. This church is doing that well. I'm really pleased to see the way our congregation is embracing technology, difficult and frustrating as it is sometimes, especially when my slides get ahead of me and all that sort of thing. But we've got to do it. Rethink volunteers. You have another full handout on that. I encourage you to please read all of it, if you would. But what can we do to meet the needs of potential volunteers so that they're volunteering for something that they think is important, that they think will change their lives, will change the organization's life, but is not going to take up half their life? How do we do that? We need to grow in faith individually. The best thing you can do for your church is to spend more time in prayer and Bible study. The best thing any of us can do for our churches is to grow in faith individually and then make time to listen to God, both as individuals and as a congregation. So, a trend that has been in the making for 70 years has gained critical momentum and has spread across all age groups, even people who are middle-aged and senior citizens are finding that the terrain has changed. And that's not a bad thing. It just is. Look west. Oh my gosh, the Rockies. It's not a bad thing. It just is. Okay. But within that, let's remember too, that we still matter. The church still matters, because if there's one thing that pandemic and quarantine, the whole, decline, social cohesion, distancing, everything the last few years have taught us is that the church is more relevant than ever, because people want to hear about God's love. People want to connect with one another and with God in genuine ways. And people want a sense of stability. And we can do that. That's something that the church can offer. But to do it, we're going to have to embrace new ways of learning, serving, and loving. Now, what does that mean for our future? I don't have a crystal ball, but here is what I think is going to happen. These are the technical changes that I think we will need to make in order to keep loving, learning, and serving so well. The technical changes we need to make that are going to help lead other people to Christ. Remember, they don't teach us this in seminary. Okay. And I don't have a crystal ball. This is based on my own experience, my own reading, my own research. This is what I think. In the future, digital worship will be accepted and commonplace. It will no longer be for the elderly, for the people in nursing homes, for the family that has a soccer game in the afternoon and they need to leave right after church, so it's just easier to stay home and do it from home. Digital worship is here to stay, and it's only going to have to get better. We are not CBS, we are not CNN. Everybody knows that, but we're being judged by the standards of CBS and CNN. Okay, so we need to be ourselves, but we need to be as good as we can. That's a technical change. And because digital worship is going to be more acceptable, that means there will be fewer people in the pews. That means the choirs will be smaller. That means that sense of critical mass will be harder to come by, further reducing that sense of social cohesion. And because there will be fewer people in the pews, I think it's likely that there will be even less income. And yes, some people will adopt online giving, and we really need to push that. We really need to push having a strong wills program. Every church, churches this size, smaller, larger, need to have a strong giving through wills program. But the reality is people give to what they identify with. They give to what they feel connected to. And that connection is more tenuous when you're connecting through a phone or a screen or an iPad. Also, we have a strong tradition on not spending money on things that we can get for free. You can get television for free. Why would you spend money on it? I can watch this worship service for free. Why should I spend money on it? And if I'm perfectly happy worshiping from home in my pajamas, why should I send those people money? I can worship from home. At the same time, and I'm not saying, this is necessarily the way it is. I'm not condemning anybody. I'm just thinking we extrapolate out, this is what I foresee. At the same time, I think our mission and pastoral care will have to increase. And it's going to be a while, I think, before youth groups or anyone else can really go hog wild again and go very far on mission trips. So mission is going to be more localized. Well, what that means, though, is that the people who watch us online, when we talk about a mission opportunity, it's going to be something that they can relate to more easily. It will be nearby. And so then small groups, both formal and informal, are going to become increasingly important to our sense of connection to our church. So the quartets, the handbells choir, the women in faith, the Bible studies, those sorts of programs, the youth groups, the food pantry, who are the same faces who do the loaves and fishes, that Oasis Thursday morning breakfast. Those sorts of things are going to become even more important than they are now. Pastoral care then is going to start becoming a prime way people relate to the church and each other. And pastors are going to end up spending more of their time connecting, relating, and praying. That means pastoral needs are going to go up, income is going to go down, digital footprint is going to become hugely important. What does that suggest? It suggests that to me, within a few years, most churches, I'm talking about most churches, will have to restructure their staffing. That's another technical change. Now remember, generally speaking, if you are under 40 and you are in worship twice a month, then you are here all the time, okay? If you're under 40, you're here twice a month, you're here all the time, you are a regular churchgoer. If you have children, that means you, the parent, are spending much, much more time teaching the faith to your children than the church is, right? Okay. So if a church wants to make a difference in the spiritual lives of children and young people, that means making a difference in the spiritual lives of their parents. Because who are they learning the faith from? Who are they learning the faith from? Yeah. In my family growing up, we had family devotions 7 mornings a week. It was very rare that we did not gather in my parents' bed, my brother and I, and listen to Bible reading and prayer and have a cup of hot tea together. Now I realize that it was rare then, and it's probably even more rare today, but I learned the faith from my parents. Church just simply reinforced it, but I was there every week because my parents made me. They didn't have any guilt issues about making me go to Sunday school. Okay, what this means then is that going forward, someone is going to have to make sure that there's excellent Christian education material on the church's website, material that parents can easily access and use. Again, an example of technical change. So we've talked about change. We've talked about technical and adaptive. We've talked about turning our paddles into walking sticks. When the terrain changes, you have to adapt. We've talked about going from bowling in leagues to bowling alone. All voluntary organizations, including churches, have been declining for decades. The pandemic has only hastened that decline. And we've talked a bit about some blue sky ideas, some technical changes that I think we may need to make to adapt to our new terrain. So let me leave you with 2 more thoughts. I'm almost done, and thank you very much for your patience. But let me leave you with 2 more big cultural mindset ideas that I think we will need to embrace in order to adapt and thrive and keep reaching people for Christ. One of those is developing a sense of adventure. I'm going on an adventure, said Bilbo Baggins. Versus Frodo. This is Bilbo, isn't it? Okay, well, boy, that sort of cultural reference just went right over this group's head. Okay, Lord of the Rings, or The Hobbit. I think this is from the Lord of the Rings movie. Anyway, he's excited. He's going on an adventure. Maybe you don't want to go on an adventure yourself. Maybe you want to go on an adventure with a bunch of other people. Maybe you don't want to go with a bunch of ogres or dwarves or whatever it is. Maybe you want to go with people who wear helmets when they go biking, for crying out loud. But it's still an adventure. Okay, we need to look at this time and our future as an adventure in spreading the gospel. The tried and true ways are not working anymore. And so we are right back there with the first missionaries in the 1st century. We have a chance to reinvent. We have a chance to try new things and new methods with a spirit of excitement, a spirit of adventure. And that's a tall order for an organization, because the theme song of every organization is "Don't rock the boat." Don't rock the boat, baby. Trip the boat over. Okay, I see some of those heads. I see some of those heads. Yes, the theme song of every organization is "Don't rock the boat." Ours needs to be spirit of adventure. Adopting then the spirit of adventure is the adaptive change we need to make. What are the technical changes we need to make in order to affect that adaptive change? And honestly, I don't know. The good news is I'm sure that you know, because you know this congregation much better than I do. Adopt the spirit of adventure. The next adaptive change that I think we need to make has to do with our focus, our orientation. Again, you wake most people up in the middle of the night, you hold a gun to their head, you say, what is a church? They will say, family, family. The problem is the nature of families. Understand, I'm all in favor of families. I like families. I have a family. I'm very happy with my family. I would want to change, well, I'd want to change some of them, but I would not want to lose my family for anything. But what is the focus of a family? Where is the orientation? It is inwards, isn't it? Families are by their very nature focused inwards. And families are hard to break into. You can be friends with a family. You can be friends with another family, but you only get to join the family by invitation of someone who's already a member. When you take my hand in marriage, then you join my family. One of my cousins just got married yesterday. He's got children, she has children, everybody's grown up. Now they've got one of these blended families. But they stood up in front of a preacher to have it done, to say you are now a part. It's very hard to join somebody's family to sort of by osmosis. And it's going to take time for those families to cohere, isn't it? How long is it going to take those grown children to get to know each other, especially when one of them is pretty resentful about what her parent did? Okay. Families are difficult to join. And so we already know then that because of the pandemic and because of the decreasing forces of social cohesion, churches are likely to shrink in the future. Even worse, it's going to be hard to do ministry to our community and the world when we are focusing our attention and energy inwards on ourselves. Doesn't mean we ignore each other. Doesn't mean we don't care for each other. But what is our basic orientation? Is it inwards or is it outwards? My recommendation then is to think of ourselves as an intentional community. We are an intentional community, intentionally committed to being Christians. Christians who are loving, serving, and learning. Again, that is the adaptive change I think we need to make because of the changing landscape in which we're doing ministry. Because of the decline in social cohesion and the further decline the emphasis on digital worship and ministry are going to bring, I believe we need to consciously adopt a spirit of adventure and think of ourselves as a community of Christians committed to learning, serving, and loving. Is it a perfect analogy? No. Do I know what the technical changes are we need to make the shift? No. Is it something that can be done overnight? No. In fact, if the family system theorists are correct, it will take 7 years to make the full transition. Now, a lot of this is going to depend on who we call to be our next installed pastor. And a lot is going to depend on how willing we are to follow our next installed pastor. Our new pastor is not going to have a very long honeymoon. She's not going to have a lot of time to get the lay of the land. And that's why the congregational mission study, Jolene has graciously agreed to be a part of over here. We've just started meeting. That's why that is so important. Our new pastor is going to be expected to hit the ground running, and that means we need to be willing to give her room and follow where she goes. If we push back too hard, if we question her direction or ideas too much, it will slow us down, and we will lose the spirit of adventure. So, where have we been? Where have we been? What have we covered? We are a good church. This is important. We are a good church. God is with us. We've talked about change. We've talked about bowling. We've talked about attendance. We've talked about technical and adaptive change. We've talked about canoeing and paddles and walking sticks and Sacagawea. We've talked about what is a church? What are the marks of a faithful church? And I did a little blue sky thinking with you. Then we talked about adventure. And we talked about intentional community. And I know it's a lot to take in. That's one reason why we were recording this. So you can go back and view it again, and I hope you will tell others about it. But I also know the longest journey is always the journey from the head to the heart. The longest journey is always the journey from the head to the heart. The good news is God is with us on our way. Thanks be to God. Thank you very much.